Fantastic. Okay, good morning. We're up to Yudalad Mabez. We are up to Utvul Yom, the third line on Yudalad Mabez. First word on the line. Our learning is Le'ila Nishbas Mindel, Mariam Bas Kamen Ruvain, her Neshama Shem and Aliyah. Okay, so let's begin. So we've been going through the list of the 18 enactments made by Hillel and Shammai. And part of the discussion about this list, we started with a Mishnah in Maseches Zavim, that had a list of 10 different things that, 10 different decrees, 10 different examples of things which are mitame truma, pasul truma. In other words, 10 things which are considered a sheni l'tuma, second degree truma, which means that when those things come into contact with truma, they make truma invalid. Not that they make truma tame, meaning it doesn't make tame a carrier of truma, but doesn't make truma a carrier of truma, but rather makes truma invalid, which means that it's a second degree truma, which means that when it touches truma, it's going to become invalid. Okay, so we're going through this list of 10 different things, and we're going to continue down that list. One of the things on the list in Maseches Zavim was Utvul Yom. What is Utvul Yom? Utvul Yom means like this. Nowadays, the one example we're aware of when it comes to going to the mikvah typically the one example that we have of going to the mikvah is a woman goes to the mikvah after she finishes her counting of 7 clean days. She goes at night. However, there are a number of examples of scenarios where a woman or a man would go to the mikvah on the 7th day, not at night. They'd go to the mikvah on the 7th day, and when the day is over, that's when they become completely pure. But during that day, after going to the mikvah, they're in this middle status. That's called a tvul yom. Tvul yom means they went on the day, tvila, yom of the day. They went to the mikvah on the final day, and that's one of the examples given in the Mishnah of an individual who is a tvul yom. They went to the mikvah on that day, and the Mishnah said that such a person, they touch truma, the truma becomes invalid. That's what the Mishnah told us, okay? So the Gemara asks, tvul yom doraisahi. Tvul yom, someone who goes to the mikvah on that day, meaning before nightfall, that person is biblically tameh, in the sense that they touch truma, the truma is going to become tameh, or rather pasul. The pasuk says, Uvah Hashemesh v'tiher, that the person who goes to the mikvah only when the sun sets, Uvah Hashemesh, when the sun comes, meaning the sun sets, v'taher, that's when they become pure, meaning that's when they are, and the pasuk continues, then they're allowed to eat holy food, truma, things of that nature. But before that, if they touch those foods, they're going to become tameh. So why is it in this list of 10 enactments, 10 things which midorabanan, we're saying that they touch truma, that truma has become tameh? It's midoraisa. So the Gemara says, you're right, some mikan tvul yom. You're right, it doesn't belong on the list. It's a kind of an interesting thing. The Gemara says, you're right, it shouldn't be here. Really, it is midoraisa. It's not a rabbinic enactment. Rather, it is biblical. Okay, now the Gemara is going to analyze a few more cases, and then we're going to have a longer discussion from the Mishnah, and then we're going to have a bit of a longer discussion about the history of Netilas Yadayim. Okay, so the Gemara continues. Va'ochlin, now's another example. We're going to quote another example from the Mishnah in Zavim. Va'ochlin shenitmu b'mashkin. The Mishnah listed one of the things that becomes a sheni l'tuma is food which became tameh through liquids. Now, it doesn't define for us what type of liquids. So the Gemara asks, what liquids did this food come into contact with? What's the story over here? So the Gemara says, if you want to tell me we're talking about liquid that came into contact with a sheretz, a sheretz is one of the creepy creatures which are tummy means doraisa, which is considered a rishon l'tuma. So the Gemara says, doraisa ninu. Liquids that come into contact with a sheretz, that is biblical. Any liquid, any liquid which we learn from that pasuk that liquids that come into contact with a sheretz become fully tameh. So that cannot be a case where we're talking if they become tameh, meaning they become a rishon l'tuma, anything they touch is going to become a sheni l'tuma. That's not rabbinic, that is biblical. Still with me? All right. In other words, basically, the Gemara is trying to find the Mishnah listed a case where it said that tameh liquid, okay, that touched food, the food becomes a sheni l'tuma, right? And now when that food touches truma, the truma is going to become pasul, right? So what liquid touched that food? We don't know. So we're trying to figure it out. And again, we're talking about a rabbinic enactment. So we have to find a case where biblically, midoraisa, it's nothing, and only rabbinically it's problematic. If you tell me the case is a case where the liquid is tameh because it came into contact with a sheretz is a rishon l'tuma midoraisa, okay? Avatuma, midoraisa, and therefore it's avatuma, the highest level, and therefore the liquid that it comes into contact with is a rishon l'tuma midoraisa, and then the liquid that comes into contact with food is a sheni l'tuma midoraisa. That's all biblical. That cannot be our case, right? That cannot be our case. We're looking for a case which is a rabbinic enactment. So that can't be it. Rather, the case of our Mishnah is talking about liquid that came into contact with unwashed hands. Okay? Unwashed hands, which we said are tameh, and now liquid comes into contact with those hands. That's the tameh liquid. When that liquid comes into contact with food, that food becomes tameh of the second degree, and therefore when that food comes into contact with truma, the truma is going to become invalid. And the Gemara says, why does this decree take place? The Gemara is trying to understand the why. It is because we're afraid it's going to be mixed up with a case where you have liquid that became tameh through coming into contact with the sheretz, and which is biblically asur, and therefore we decree on liquid that comes into contact with the hand that it's going to be rabbinically asur. Okay, fine. Next case, again, we have a case where it talks about utensils which became tameh by coming into contact with the liquid. Ask the Gemara, what kind of liquid did the utensils come into contact with? If you want to say the utensils came into contact with the liquid that generates from a zav. A zav is a person who is impure and is an avatum of the highest degree. Again, the Gemara asks the same question. That is someone, if liquid that comes directly from a zav and touches a utensil, that utensil is a rishon l'tumah, and therefore the anything that's going to come in, the liquid that comes to contact those utensils is a sheni l'tumah all midaraisa. The Gemara just proves this. When the zav, if the zav who is an avatuma spits on an individual, that individual becomes tameh on the first degree. Okay? Fine. The Gemara now just parenthetically mentions a limud that we learned from that pasuk, Masha biyad tahar timesi lach. That means is that it's not only if it's direct contact, but let's say you have a case where, I don't know, I'm holding this piece of paper and a zav spits on the piece of paper. Did I touch the spit? No. But I'm carrying the spit, so there I'm also going to be tameh, meaning there's tumas maga, which is direct contact, there's tumas masa, where I'm carrying it. This is parenthetical, and we just learned that from this pasuk. But the bottom line is that the liquid that comes directly from a zav and then touches something else, that something else becomes a rishon l'tumah, and therefore that's a doraisa case. Ella b'mashkin haba machmas sheretz. Rather, we're talking about liquid that comes into contact with a sheretz. Okay, so again, let's think this through. Liquid that comes into contact with a sheretz is going to become a rishon l'tumah, and it's going to touch utensils, and if it touches utensils, it's going to go to the next level. If it's coming, it was derisa from before, the one case we were talking about before. Liquid that comes into contact with the sheretz is deraisa. But 1 second, we're talking about, give me 1 second, mashkin, 1 second, mashkin above machmas sheretz, we're up to kelim shenu b'mashkin, right? So the scenario is going to be, 1 second, right, why is this not deraisa? 1 second. So it's mashkin haba machmas sheretz.
I think we're still talking about where it's a keli, where it's a clean, not
yeah, look at Rashi here. Gzer mishum mashkin abam machmas sheretz. The ashkan mehen shehein rishonim, right? They are rishon d'oraisa. Had gazer b'chol tumas mashkin lios tchila lo gazer am be'ochling gzer mishum ochel abam machmas sheretz. Hainu time adam mashkin mishum l'ula alulin l'kabel tumash and tzrichan tikon hechsher levian l'day tuma bal ochlin tzrichan tikon. No, that's going that. Sorry, 1 second. Sorry, that's the wrong Rashi.
Is it the next one?
About ban machmas sheretz. The lav av hatumahin. Okay, about kli in mekabel tuma elami avatuma. Right. That's the point. The point is that a kli, we're talking about a keli, which is midoraisa, not able to be mekabel tuma, and therefore the whole enactment over here is derabanan. In other words, if it's going to be if it's a liquid that comes from a zav, then that is going to be something which is asur midoraisa. But the liquid that comes to contact with the sheretz that touches a kli, that is not asur midoraisa, and therefore it is enactment derabanan gzer mishum mashkin zav. In other words, liquid that comes to contact with the sheretz touching a kli, the kli would not become asur midoraisa, and therefore the whole thing is derabanan. Okay? That's the case. Okay? Fine. Period. Bottom line is, the Gemara now just brought a number of examples where unpacking those examples from the Mishnah, explaining how they are Rabbanan and not Midoraisa. So now the Gemara is going to have an extensive discussion about Netilas Yadayim. We're going to learn a little bit about the history of Netilas Yadayim. We wash our hands before eating bread. Why? Where does that come from? So the Gemara is going to have a whole discussion. Again, let's keep in mind the context. The Mishnah was talking about a case. The Mishnah says hands are tameh klape what? Regarding truma. In other words, all the Mishnah told us is that when my hands touch truma, the truma becomes invalid. Now, you and I, when we eat bread, that's not truma, right? That's just what we call chulin, regular food. So we're going to have to come back to that. But the part of the discussion begins with understanding where the enactment comes regarding hands touching truma, which we say the hands touching truma are become pasul, becomes invalid. We're going to have to come back to the question of how does that apply? Where does this whole thing come to? Our hands touching chulin, which is on obviously a lower degree. Truma is some level of sanctity. Chulin, the regular bread we eat, that's not sanctified at all. Why does it become tameh? We'll get there. So let's now just learn a little bit of history. So the Gemara asks like this: Via Dayim, the Mishnah said that hands is one of the examples from the Mishnah Zavin, but also we're telling the Gemara is telling us that those are one of the examples of the 18 enactments made in that attic. That again, what did the Mishnah told us? To tell us, the Mishnah told us that the students of Shammai and Hillel got together and they discussed a bunch of things in this attic, and they came up with 18 enactments, 18 decrees. And we're saying now that the Mishnah Zavin, which says that hands touching truma becomes pasul, that is one of the enactments. So the Gemara is going to question this based on our history of understanding of the enactments of washing hands. Ask the Gemara, V'yadayim, Talmidei Shammai v'Hillel Gazer? Why are you telling me that the students of Shammai and Hillel, they're the ones who decreed this? It's not true. Shammai v'Hillel Gazer. It's not the students of Shammai and Hillel, rather it's Shammai and Hillel themselves who made this decree. Ditani have a brisa. Yosi ben Yoezer, east straight of Yosi ben Yochanan, ish Yerushalayim, Gazru Tuma al Eretz Amim. Okay, these two people, this is those names may sound familiar if you learn Pirkei Avos. They are part of the Zugim, they are part of the pairs of people who used to lead the Jewish people. So these two Yosis, they had a number of decrees. One of those decrees was that they were Gozer Tuma on Eretz Amim. What that means is that we assume that throughout all of Chutz La'aretz, we assume there are corpses everywhere. The non-Jews were not as careful as Jews were in terms of burial, and therefore there's just this concern that it's not just in cemeteries that we know that there is tumah, but rather we assume if a person traveled to Chutz La'aretz and then wants to go back and want to go to the Beis HaMikdash, we assume they're tameh. Even though they didn't go to the cemetery, we assume they're tameh anywhere because people, Jews were very careful about tumah, but non-Jews didn't have the same laws, and therefore we assume anywhere in Chutz La'aretz there is tumah. So that's one of the things they decreed. V'klis chuchis. They also decreed that a klis chuchis, meaning a glass utensil, is going to be is tameh. Now in the Torah, there's no mention of glass. Okay, glass is a major discussion amongst the poskim about its status due to the fact that the Torah is not clear about how we treat glass. So there is a rabbinic decree. This comes into questions of koshering glass, which comes up all the time, things of that nature. But the Chazal came along, these people came along and made it that a glass utensil is going to become tameh. Okay, Shimon ben Shetach tikein ksuba liisha. Shimon ben Shetach instituted a ksuba for a wife. Now that's not entirely accurate because ksuba is actually midoraisa. The Torah institutes that a ksuba is that a man has to give his wife a ksuba. Shimon ben Shetach came along and added a level to it. What was the thing that he added? In the Torah, it says that if a person divorces his wife, he has to give her X amount of money. He has to give her some money. Now, from the Torah, what he would be allowed to do, and prior to Shimon ben Shetach coming along, what he would be allowed to do is he would say, okay, let's say he had a car, and he would say that car is going to act as the payment for the ksuba. When they got married, he'd say this car acts as the payment for the ksuba, and therefore, if a guy gets mad at his spouse, at his wife, he's able to say, take the car, get out of here. Here's your ksuba. I don't want to be married to you. Shimon ben Shetach said that's too easy. It's too easy. It's too easy to have a movable item that a person's able to be divorced. We're very sensitive, and part of the whole institution of ksuba was this concern of a person getting married, getting divorced too easily, one to make it a little bit challenging in order to prevent a person from being flippant about it, and therefore said it's going to be limited to land. It has to be karka. Karka, you don't just pick up a piece of land and give it to someone. You can't. What you have to do is you have to sell the land, you have to get the value from the land, and therefore making it a little more difficult to get divorced in order to ensure that a person wouldn't flippantly go ahead and do so. So that's what Shimon ben Shetach's institution was, that a ksuba is paid from land and not from a movable item. Okay, fine. That's Shimon ben Shetach. V'gazer tuma al klei matachos, and they decreed impurity on metal utensils, which the Gemara later on is going to ask, what are you talking about? Metal utensils, that is biblical, not a decree. Fine. And here's the one that we're getting at. Shammai v'Hillel gazer tuma al yadayim. And Shammai and Hillel, they came along and decreed that there is impurity on hands. So why does our Mishnah, we said earlier that it was the students of Shammai and Hillel that went ahead and said that hands are tameh. But here we see it was Shammai and Hillel themselves. Right? Sometimes we confuse this thing. It's very common when people say Beis Shammai, Beis Hillel, Shammai and Hillel. They're two separate things. One is the people themselves, and one is their students. So the Mishnah we said earlier said is that it's the students who instituted this. What do you mean? It's the teachers themselves. So it says the Gemara, V'chi Teman, maybe you'll tell me, maybe it's, we were not so accurate. Shame v'siyato, v'hil v'siyato. Maybe this brayso we just quoted, it was inaccurate. Maybe it was saying that Shammai and, or rather our Mishnah, when it said that the students decreed things, really it was Shammai and students, and Hillel and the students. And therefore there's no contradiction. Meaning, you're saying one place it says Shammai and Hillel, and one place it says the students. Say, no, it's one and the same. When it said students, it means the rabbis were there as well. The teachers were there as well. They were still alive. Ask the Gemara, that can't be. From Yehuda Shmuel, Yudches Davar Gazru, Uve Yudches Nechliku. The Mishnah, we have a teaching from Yehuda Shmuel who says that the 18 things that were decreed upon were argued upon, and then they finally concluded like Shammai about all of them. Okay, but the point is that it tells us that they argued about these things. But when it comes to Hillel and Shammai, they only argued about 3 things. And there are only 3 places to argue. It's such a fascinating thing. Again, not so well known. We always think of like classic arguers are Shammai and Hillel. They argue about everything. It's not true. Shammai and Hillel only argued about 3 things. It was their students who argued about many things. The Rambam has a whole discussion. Why is it that Shammai and Hillel students were the ones who were famous about arguing, that they have all these debates? But Shammai and Hillel themselves only argued 3 places. Rambam famously says that the reason you have all these machloksim is because they didn't learn from their teachers in an attentive fashion. They basically were not. They're a little lazy in their studies, and that's what comes about, where all these machloksim come about, because the Masorah, the tradition from teacher to student, starts getting iffy when you play broken telephone. If you're really being attentive, it doesn't happen. But Shammai and Hillel, that era, things start to get a little bit messy. But that's Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel, it's the students. Shammai and Hillel, they only argued about 3 things. Everything else they agreed. So don't tell me that when it says Shammai, when it says that our Mishnah says Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel, really Shammai and Hillel were there. No, because that would mean they argued about 18 more things. We know they only argued about 3 things. So when it says, okay, maybe v'chitema asu inu gazer litlos v'asu tamadai v'gazer lisrof. Okay, so maybe you want to tell me there was 2 stages to the enactment. Shammai and Hillel said, when your hands touch truma, the truma is invalid, but we don't burn it. Okay, in other words, there's 2 stages of invalidity. Is that a word? Yeah, it's a word. Okay, so basically meaning that sometimes you could say something is like uncertain, and therefore it cannot be treated as truma. But then you say it's pasul. If it's pasul, that means full-fledged invalid, and you would burn it. So maybe Shammai and Hillel said you touch truma with your unwashed hands, and we say you can't use it. And the students came along and said that's not enough. You have to go further, and they said you should burn it, meaning treating it full-fledged pasul. Like Gemara says can't be. V'amar Ilfa, we have a teaching from Ilfa who said Yadayim tchilas gzeirason l'sreifa, that the first stage of enactment about hands was that when your hands touch truma, it should be burnt. So don't tell me the first stage of the enactment was that it should be litlos, literally means to hang, that you can't use it, but it's not going to be burnt. That's not true. Ilfa told us the first stage of the enactment was that it should be burnt. Okay, so Ella asu inu gazer v'lo kablu minayu. Fascinating. So when it says Shammai and Hillel came along, they made a decree, but the decree was not accepted by anyone. Okay, sometimes this happens. Sometimes you could have some people come along. I don't know, you want a good example of this? Is the rabbis came along a few years ago when many of us were like teenagers, and they made an enactment that you can only have like 1 musician at a wedding, and the wedding can only have X amount of guests. Remember that? The big takanas? It never was accepted. It never was accepted. Never took off, right? So there is a general principle that sometimes, the chachamim of the day come along, they make an enactment, it just doesn't take off. Okay, it happens. It happens. If it doesn't take off, then it doesn't become law, and it never became law. No one could argue. So, you're going against the takanas of the stages of our day by making a wedding with 3 people in your band. It never took off. Okay. However, va'asu tamidayu gazru v'kiblu minayu. The students came along and it was accepted. So basically, generation 1, it wasn't accepted. The students came along later, they argued about it, and it was ultimately accepted. So that's the genesis of this thing. When it said Hillel and Shammai made this decree, it's true. It just never took off. And then the students a generation later came along, after they died already, and rehashed the issue, and it took off finally. Okay, sometimes things take a while. Ask the Gemara Vakati Shlomo Gazar, what are you talking about? Why are you saying Hillel and Shammai and the students were the ones who decreed it? Shlomo Melech was the one who decreed it. So we have a teaching that says that Shlomo came along and instituted Erevin, the concept of an Erev, and Netilas Yadayim, And Yatsa Baskal Amra Bani Im Chacham Libecha Yismach Libi Gamani Chacham Bani V'Samach Libi V'Shiva Chorfi V'Shivi Chorfi Davar Ata. Okay, so basically we're learning from this pasuk over here, Chorfi Davar, Chorfi Davar, excuse me. So basically we learn from these psukim, without unpacking this we don't have time, that Shlomo was the one who was Misaki in Netilas Yadayim. The Mefarshim points out, I think it's the Rashash who points out that until the time of Shlomo was not a time of peace. The state of it, the country of Israel, Eretz Yisrael was at state of war. There's a halacha that if you're at war, and this is practical nowadays, if you're waging war, you don't have to wash Tilas Yadayim because you're at war. So the entire country was at war. Until Shlomo came along, the country was not at peace. So it's not coincidental that Shlomo was the one, and the same with Eruvin. If you're at war and you're in a place which is not a full-fledged Doraisa, Rishus Ram Rishus Yachid, you're allowed to carry. It's only when you're in a place of peace, then the rabbinic decree comes along. So it makes sense that Shlomo was the one that instituted these things because it was the first time that the land was at a state of peace. Fine. So the Gemara says Shlomo. So, but the bottom line is, it says Shlomo was the one who made this decree. So the Gemara says yes. Shlomo Gazul Kachim. Shlomo came along and said, "My hands are tamei if they touch Kachim." Kachim is the highest level of sanctity. Kachim is things which are sanctified for the base of Mikdash. V'asu inu v'gazor af l'truma. And Hillel and Shammai says, yeah, your hands are going to be tamei for truma as well. Okay, so basically, again, Shlomo came along and instituted, your hands are tamei for kachim unless you wash your hands. Hillel and Shammai came along and said, your hands are tamei if they touch truma. Okay, so what does it have to do with us? Why do we wash our hands this time for bread? The bottom line is that Chazal wanted to ensure that all of us, even though truma, you and I, for all of us who are not Kohanim over here, no Kohanim over here, we do not eat truma, even if the base of English was still standing. Chazal wanted to ensure that it would become so, that there is this concern that the Kohanim would end up touching truma with tamei hands, and therefore to ensure that the Kohanim would be accustomed to washing their hands before eating truma, they said everyone should be washing their hands, at least for bread, which is the main thing. And even though we do not have a base of English right now, but think about the fact that for 2,000 years we've been washing our hands because we believe the base of English is going to be rebuilt any day, and we want to create habits right now to ensure that when the base of English is rebuilt, the Kohanim will be ready to do so. It's like an amazing thing when you wash your hands. People have the washing your hands phobia, and more about the benching. But the point is that the faith, the emunah that's needed every time we wash our hands is because the fact that we have to be sensitive to the Kohanim. Even though we're not Kohanim, we want to be sensitive to them. We want to create a culture where it's easier for the Kohanim to be in a state of purity, right? That's number one, which is wild and mind-blowing. But B, it's because of this emunah that we held on for 2,000 years. We're washing our hands so that B'mher v'yameinu, the building will be rebuilt, and we'll all be in a habit to be able to eat truma, which is just an incredible reflection of our faith. Have a wonderful day. Take care.